Hello, everybody. We're still processing November the 5th. I was in the countryside of Northern Virginia a few days ago. Saw a sign for people just listening, a Trump-Vance 2024 sign with winner underneath. Some people are happy. Most, I guess, of our listeners probably aren't. Certainly, a lot of our guests aren't. My old friend John Roush was on the show yesterday, talking about what he called the catastrophic ordinariness of the election and of contemporary America. He authored two responses to the election. Firstly, he described it in Unpopulist as a moral catastrophe, but wearing his Brookings hat, he's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, described it as an ordinary election. I think a lot of people are scratching their head trying to make sense of it. Another old friend of the show, David Masciotra, a cultural writer, political writer, had an interesting piece in the Washington Monthly entitled "How Francis Fukuyama and the Big Lebowski Explain Trump's Victory." A very creative piece, and he is joining us from Highland, Indiana, not too far from Chicago. David, the Big Lebowski and Francis Fukuyama. Those two don't normally go together, certainly in a title. Let's talk first about Fukuyama. How does Fukuyama explain November the 5th?
Well, first, thanks for having me. And I should say I watched your conversation with Jonathan Roush, and it was quite riveting and quite sobering. And you talked about Fukuyama in that discussion as well. And you referenced his book, The End of History and The Last Man, a very often misinterpreted book, but nonetheless, toward its conclusion, Fukuyama warns that without an external enemy, liberal democracies may indeed turn against themselves, and we may witness an implosion rather than an explosion. And Fukuyama said that this won't happen so much for ideological reasons, but it will happen for deeply psychological ones, namely, without a just cause for which to struggle, people will turn against the just cause itself, which in this case is liberal democracy. And out of a sense of boredom and alienation, they'll grow increasingly tired of their society and cultivate something of a death wish in which they enjoy imagining their society's downfall, or at least the downfall of some of the institutions that are central to their society. And now I would argue that after the election results, we've witnessed the transformation of imagining to inviting. So there's a certain death wish and sense of alienation and detachment from that which made the United States of America a uniquely prosperous and stable country with the ability to self-correct the myriad injustices we know are part of its history. Well, now people, because they aren't aware of the institutions or norms that created this robust engine of commerce and liberty, they've turned against it, and they no longer invest in that which is necessary to preserve it. And that's something.
It's interesting, David. The more progressives I talk to about this, the more there's an odd thing going on. You're all sounding very conservative. The subtitle of the piece in the Washington Monthly was looking at constituencies or issues misses the big point. On Tuesday, nihilism was on display, even a death wish in a society wrought by cynicism. Words like nihilism and cynicism, David, historically always been used by people like Alan Bloom, whose book, of course, The Closing of the American Mind, became very powerful amongst American conservatives now 40 or 50 years ago. would you accept that using language like nihilism and cynicism uh, isn't always associated? I mean, you're a proud progressive. You're a man of the left. You've never disguised that. It's rather odd to imagine that guys like you and in your own and in his own way, John Roush too, who talks about the moral catastrophe of the election a couple of weeks ago. You're all speaking about the loss of morality of the voter or of America. Is there any truth to that? Making some sense?
That's a fair observation, and Jonathan Rauch, during your conversation and in his own writing, identifies as center right. I would say I'm center left.
And
Uh,
he's but what's interesting, what ties you together is that you both use the L word, liberal, to
yes,
define yourselves. He's perhaps a liberal, or a liberal on the right. You're a liberal on the left.
yes, and I think that the Trump era, if we can trace that back to 2015, has made thoughtful liberals more conservative in thought and articulation, because it forces a confrontation and interrogation of a certain naivete. George Will writes in his book, The Conservative Sensibility, that the progressive imagines that which is the best possible outcome and strives to make it real, whereas the conservative imagines the worst possible outcome and does everything he can to guard against it. And now it feels like we've experienced, at least electorally, the worst possible outcome. So there's a certain revisitation of that which made America great, to appropriate a phrase, and look for where we went wrong in failing to preserve it. So that kind of thinking inevitably leads one to use more conservative language and deal in more conservative thought.
Yeah. So for you, what made America great, to use the term you just introduced, was what? Its morality, the intrinsic morality of people living in it, in the country. Is that for you what liberalism is?
Liberalism is a system and the culture that emanates out of that system. So it's a constitutional order that creates, or that places a premium on individual rights and allows for a flourishing free market. Now, where my conception of liberalism would enter the picture, and perhaps Jonathan Rauch and I would have some disagreements, certainly George Will and I, is that a bit of governmental regulation is necessary along with the social welfare state to civilize the free market. But the culture that one expects to flow from that societal order and arrangement is one of aspiration, one in which citizens fully accept that they are contributing agents to this experiment in self-governance, and therefore need to spend time in, to use a Walt Whitman phrase, freedom's gymnasium, sharpening the intellect, sharpening one's sense of moral duty and obligation to the commons, to the public good. And as our society has become more individualistic and narcissistic in nature, those commitments have vanished. And as our society has become more anti-intellectual in nature, we are seeing a lack of understanding of why those commitments are even necessary. So that's why you get a result like we witnessed on Tuesday, and that I argue in my piece that you're kind enough to have me on to discuss, is a form of nihilism. And the Big Lebowski reference, of course,
Yeah, and
comes.
of course, I want to get to Lebowski
Oh,
because
sure, great.
the Fukuyama stuff is interesting, but that's everyone's writing about Fukuyama and the end of history and why history never really ended. Of course, it's been going on for years now, but it's a particularly interesting moment. We've had Fukuyama on the show. I've never heard anyone, though, compare the success of Trump and Trumpism with the Big Lebowski. So one of the great movies, of course, American movies. What's the connection, David, between November 5th and The Big Lebowski?
Well, my mind immediately, Big Lebowski is one of my favorite films. I've written about it, and I even appeared at one of the Big Lebowski festivals that takes place in the United States a number of years ago. Uh, but my mind went to the scene where when the dude is in his bathtub, and these three menacing figures break into his apartment.
Mm.
They drop a gerbil in the bathtub, and the dude who was enjoying a joint by candlelight is of course startled and frightened. And these three men tell him that if he does not pay the money they believe he owes them, they will come back and, in their words, cut off your Johnson. And the dude gives them a quizzical, bemused look. And one of them says, "You think we are kidding? We are nihilists. We believe in nothing." And then one of them screams, "We'll cut off your Johnson." Well, I thought, we're looking at an electorate that increasingly, or at least a portion of the electorate, increasingly believes in nothing. So we've lost faith.
It's the nihilists again, and of course,
Yes,
there's
the
another Johnson
nihilists
in
are
America. There was once a president called Johnson who enjoyed waving his Johnson, I think, around in public, and now there's the head of the House is another Johnson. I think he's
right.
probably a little shyer than President LBJ. But David, coming back to this idea of nihilism, it often seems to be a word used by people who don't like what other people think and therefore just write it off as nihilism. Are you suggesting that the Trump crowd have no beliefs? Is that what nihilism for you is? I mean, he was very clear about what he believes in. You may not like it, but it doesn't seem to be nihilistic.
That's another fair point. What I'm referring to is not too long ago, we lived in a country that had a shared set of values. Those values have vanished. So, and those values involve adherence to our democratic norms. It's very difficult to imagine had George H.W. Bush attempted to steal the election in which Bill Clinton won, that George H.W. Bush could have run again and won. So we've lost faith in something essential to our electoral system. We've lost faith in the standards of decency that used to, albeit imperfectly, regulate our national politics. So the man to whom I just referred, Bill Clinton, was nearly run out of office for having an extramarital affair, a misdeed that cannot compare to the myriad infractions of Donald Trump. And yet Trump's misdeeds almost give him a cultural cachet among his supporters. It almost makes him, for lack of a better word, cool. And now we see, even with Trump's appointments, I mean, of course, it remains to be seen how it plays out, that we're losing faith in credentials and
Well, they're certainly
expertise.
a band of outlaws and
Yes.
very proud to be outlaws. It could almost be a Hollywood script. But I wonder, David, whether there's a more serious critique here. You, like so many other people, both on the left and the right, are nostalgic for an age in which everyone supposedly agreed on things, a more civil and civilized age. You go back to the Bushes, back to Clinton. But the second Bush, who now seems to have appeared as this icon, at least moral icon of many critics of Trump, was also someone who unleashed a terrible war, killing tens of thousands of people, creating enormous suffering for millions of others. And I think that would be the Trump response, that he's simply more honest, that in the old days, the Bushes of the world can speak politely and talk about consensus, and they'd unleashed terrible suffering overseas, and at home in their neoliberal policies of globalization. Trump's simply more honest. He tells it as it is, and that isn't nihilistic, is it?
Well, you are gesturing towards an important factor in our society. Trump, of course, we know is a dishonest man, a profoundly dishonest man.
Well, in some ways, but in other ways, he doesn't. He isn't. I mean, in some ways, he just tells the truth as it is. It's a truth that we're uncomfortable with, but
right.
It's certainly very truthful about the impact of foreign wars on America, for example, or even the impact of globalization.
What you're describing is an authenticity, that Trump is authentic. And authenticity has become chief among the modern virtues, which I would argue is a colossal error. Stanley Crouch, a great writer, spent decades analyzing the way in which we consider authenticity and how it inevitably leads to borrow his phrase, casting purity onto the bottom. So anything that which requires effort, refinement, self-restraint, self-control, plays to the crowd as inauthentic, as artificial. So
Well, those are
therefore,
old aristocratic values that may have once worked, but don't anymore. Should we be nostalgic for the aristocratic way of the Bushes?
I think in a certain respect we should. We shouldn't be nostalgic for George W. Bush's policies. I agree with you. The war in Iraq was catastrophic, arguably worse than anything Trump did while he was president. His notoriously poor response to Hurricane Katrina. I mean, we can go on and on cataloging the various disasters of the Bush administration. However, George W. Bush as president and the people around him did have a certain belief in the liberal order of the United States and the liberal order of the world, institutions like NATO and the EU. And those institutions and that order has given the United States and the world more broadly an unrivaled period of peace and prosperity.
Well, there wasn't peace, David. The wars, the post 9/11 wars, were catastrophic, and again, they seem to be just facades.
We also had the Vietnam War, the Korean War. I'm talking, when I say peace, I mean we didn't have a world war break out as we did in the First World War and the Second World War. And that's largely due to the creation and maintenance of institutions following the Second World War that were aimed at the preservation of order and at least amicable relations between countries that might otherwise collide.
You're also the author, David, of a book we've always wanted to talk about. Now we're figuring out a way to integrate it into the show. You wrote a book, an interesting book about Bruce Springsteen, Working on a Dream, the progressive political vision of Bruce Springsteen. Bruce Springsteen has made himself very clear. He turned out for Harris, showed up with his old friend Barack Obama, clearly didn't have the kind of impact he wanted. You wrote an interesting piece for Unheard a few weeks ago with the title, Bruce Springsteen is the last American liberal. He's still proud to be born in the USA. Is he the model of a liberal response to the MAGA movement, Springsteen?
Well, of course, I wouldn't go so far as to say he's the last liberal, as most realists probably know. Writers don't compose their own
I always do
headlines.
that on writers, but he's certainly the if not the last American liberal, the quintessential American liberal.
Yes, he represents as a cultural icon a certain expression of liberalism, a big-hearted, humanistic liberalism that exercises creativity to represent diverse constituencies in our society, that believes in art as a tool of democratic engagement, and that seeks to lead with an abounding and abiding sense of compassion and empathy. Uh, that is the kind of liberalism, both with a small and capital L, that I believe in and that I have spent my career documenting and attempting to advance. And those are, of course, the forms of liberalism that now feel as if they're under threat. Now, to that point, uh, this could have just come down to inflation and some egregious campaign errors of Kamala Harris. But it does feel as if when you have 70 some odd million people vote for the likes of Donald Trump, that the values one can uh, learn or one can observe in the music of Bruce Springsteen or in the rhetoric of Barack Obama, for that matter, are no longer as powerful and pervasive as they were in their respective glory days. No pun
Yeah, and of
intended.
course, Springsteen is famous for singing "Glory Days." I wonder, though, whether Springsteen himself is a little bit more complex, and we might be a little bit more ambivalent about him. There was a piece recently about him becoming a billionaire, so it's all very well him being proud to be born in the USA. He's part, for better or worse. I mean, it's not a criticism, but it's a reality. He's part of the super rich. He showed out for Harris, but didn't seem to make any impact. You talked about the diversity of Springsteen. I went to one of his concerts in San Francisco earlier this year, and I have to admit, I was struck by the fact that practically everyone at the concert was white. Everyone was wealthy. Everyone paid several $100s to watch a 70-year-old man prance around on stage and behave as if he's still 20 or 30 years old. I wonder whether Springsteen himself is also emblematic of a kind of cultural or political or even moral crisis of our old cultural elites, or am I being unfair to Springsteen?
Well, I remember once attending a Springsteen show in which the only black person I saw who wasn't an employee of the arena was Clarence Clemens.
Right, and
Uh,
Bruce, of course, always made a big deal, and there was an interesting conversation when Springsteen and Obama did a podcast together. Obama, in his own unique way, lectured Bruce a little bit about Clarence Clemens in terms of his race. But sorry, go on.
yeah, so and Springsteen has written and discussed how he had wished he had a more diverse audience. When I referred to diversity in his music, I meant the stories he aimed to tell in song. Certainly represented a wide range of the American experience. But when you talk about Springsteen, perhaps himself representing a moral crisis,
I wouldn't say a
uh,
crisis, but he represents the, shall we say, the redundancy of that liberal worldview of the late 20th century. I mean, he clearly wears his heart on the sleeve. He means well. He's not a bad guy, but he doesn't reach a diverse audience. His work is built around the American working class. None of them can afford to show up to what he puts on. I mean, Chris Christie is a much more typical fan than the white working class. Does it speak of the fact that there's I don't know if you'd call it a crisis. It's just Springsteen isn't relevant anymore in the America of the 2020s, or at least what he
yes,
sang
yes,
and wrote about no longer exists.
yes, I agree with that. So first of all, the working class bit was always a bit overblown with Springsteen. Springsteen, of course, was never really part of the working class, except when he was a child. But by his own admission, he never had a 9 to 5 job. And Springsteen sang about working class life like William Shakespeare wrote about teenage love. He did so with a poetic grandeur that inspired some of his best work. And outside looking in, he actually managed to offer more insights than sometimes people on the inside can amount to themselves. But you're certainly correct. I mean, the Broadway show, for example, when the tickets were something like $1,000 a piece, and it was $25 to buy a beer. There is a certain
Yeah, and in that
distance
Broadway
there.
show, which I went to, I thought it was astonishing, actually, a million times better than the show in San Francisco. But he
It was one of the
acknowledges
best
that he
things he
made
ever did.
everything up, that he wasn't part of the American working
Right.
class, and that he'd never worked a day in his life, and yet his whole career is built around representing a social class and a way of life that he was never part of.
Right, and he has a lyric himself. It's a sad, funny ending when you find yourself pretending a rich man in a poor man's shirt. So there always was this hypocrisy. And hypocrisy might be a little too strong. Inconsistency, and he always had a playful or he adopted a playful attitude toward it in the '90s and in later years. But to your point of relevance, I think you're on to something there, and one of the crises I would measure in our society is that we no longer live in a culture of ambition and aspiration. So you hear this when people say that they want a political leader who talks like the average person or the common man. And you hear this when college educated is actually used as an insult against a certain base of Democratic voters. There were fewer college educated voters when John F. Kennedy, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan ran for president, all of whom spoke with greater eloquence and a more expansive vocabulary and a greater sense of cultural sophistication than Donald Trump or Kamala Harris did. And yet there was no objection because people understood that we should aspire to something more sophisticated. We should aspire to something more elevated beyond the everyday vernacular of the working class. And for that reason, Springsteen was able to become something of a working class poet, despite never living among the working class beyond his childhood, because his poetry, put to music, represented something idealistic about the working class.
But oddly enough, it was a dream. It was a word that Springsteen uses a lot in his work that was bought by the middle class. It wasn't something that was, although I think in the early days, probably certainly in New Jersey, that he had a more working class
Right.
following.
And
It's
we have to deal
interesting.
with the
Sorry, go on.
we have to deal with the interesting and frustrating reality that the people about whom Springsteen sings in those early songs, like "Darkness on the Edge of Town" or "The River," would probably be Trump supporters if they were real.
Yeah, and in your piece, you refer to his, not perhaps one of his most famous albums, The Rising, but you use it to compare Springsteen with another major figure now in America, much younger man, Ta-Nehisi Coates, who has a new book out, which is an important new book, The Message. You seem to be keener on Springsteen than Coates. Tell us about this comparison and what the comparison tells us about the America of the 2020s.
Well, Coates, the reason I make the comparison is that one of Springsteen's greatest artistic moments, in which he kind of resurrected his status as cultural icon, was the record he put out after the 9/11 attack on the United States, The Rising. And throughout that record, he pays tribute, sometimes overtly, sometimes subtly, to the first responders who ascended in the tower and knowing they would perhaps die.
Yeah, you quote him, "Love and duty called you someplace higher." So he was idealizing those very brave firefighters, policemen who gave up their lives on 9/11.
Exactly, representing the best of humanity. Whereas Ta-Nehisi Coates, who has become the literary superstar of the American left, wrote in his memoir that on 9/11 he felt nothing and did not see the first responders as human. Rather, they were part of the fire that could, in his words, crush his body.
Yeah, and he wrote a piece, "What is 9/11 to descendants of slaves?"
Yes. Uh, and my point in making that comparison, and this was before the election, was to say that the American left has its own uh, crisis of, if we don't want to use the word nihilism, you objected to it earlier.
Well, I'm
But
not objecting. I like the word. It's just curious to hear it come from somebody like yourself, a man,
okay,
certainly a progressive. Maybe not. You might not define yourself as being on the left, but certainly more on the left than on the right.
yes, I would agree with that characterization. But that the left has its own crisis of nihilism. If you are celebrating a man who, despite his journalistic talents and intelligence, none of which I would deny, refused to see the humanity of the first responders on the 9/11 attack, and said that he felt nothing for the victims, presumably even those who were black and impoverished, uh, then you have your own crisis of belief. And juxtaposing that with the big-hearted humanistic liberalism of Springsteen, for me, shows the left a better path forward. Now, that's a path that will increasingly close after the victory of Trump, because extremism typically begets extremism. And we're probably about to undergo 4 years of dueling cynicism and rage. An unhappy
Yeah,
time
I mean, some people
indeed.
might respond, David, and say, "Well, Coates is just telling the truth. Why should a people with a history of slavery care that much about a few white people killed on 9/11 when their own people lost millions through slavery?" And you compare him to Springsteen, as you've acknowledged, a man who wasn't exactly telling the truth in his art. I mean, he's a very good artist, but he writes about a working class, which even he acknowledges he made most of it up. So isn't Coates like Trump in an odd kind of way? Aren't they just telling an unvarnished truth that people don't want to hear, an impolite truth?
I'm not sure. I typically shy away from the expression "my truth" or "his truth" because it's too relativistic. But I'll make an exception in this case. I think Coates is telling his truth, just as Trump is telling his truth. If that adds up to the truth, is much more dubious. Yes, we could certainly say that because the United States enslaved, tortured, and otherwise oppressed millions of black people, it may be hard for some black observers to get teary-eyed on 9/11, but the black leaders whom I most admire didn't have that reaction. I wrote a book about Jesse Jackson after spending 6 years interviewing with him and traveling with him. He certainly didn't react that way on 9/11. Congressman John Lewis didn't react that way on 9/11. So the heroes of the civil rights movement, who helped to overcome those brutal systems of oppression, uh, and I wouldn't argue that they're overcome entirely, but they helped to revolutionize the United States. They maintained a big-hearted sense of empathy and compassion, and they recognized that the unjust loss of life uh, demands mourning and respect, whether it's within their own community or another. So I would say that here again, we're back to the point of ambition, whether it's intellectual ambition or moral ambition. Uh, Ambition is what allows a society to grow. And it seems like ambition has fallen far out of fashion. And that is why the country, the slim majority of the electorate that did vote and the 40% of the electorate that did not vote, or voting age public, I should say, uh, settled for the likes of Donald Trump.
I wonder what the dude would do if he was around at the victory of Trump, or even at 9/11. He'd probably continue to sit in the bathtub and enjoy whatever he does in his bathtub.
Yeah, the dude.
I mean, he's not a believer, isn't he? The ultimate nihilist, the dude in Lebowski.
That's an interesting interpretation. I would say that is the dude a nihilist? You have this juxtaposition. The dude kind of occupies this middle ground between the nihilists who proudly declare they believe in nothing, and his friend Walter Sobchak, who's almost this raving
Ex-Vietnam guy.
explosion of belief. Yeah, ex-Vietnam veteran who's always confronting people with his beliefs and screaming and demanding they all adhere to his rules. I don't know if the dude's a nihilist as much as he has a Zen detachment.
Right. I think what makes The Big Lebowski such a wonderful film, and perhaps so relevant today, is Lebowski, unlike so many Americans, doesn't have if there's such a word, unjudgmental. He's not an angry man. He's
Mhm.
incredibly tolerant. He accepts everyone, even when they're beating him up or ripping him off. And he's so, in that sense, different from the America of the 2020s, where
Yes.
everyone is angry and everyone blames someone else for whatever's wrong in their lives.
That's exactly right.
Is that liberal or just Zen? I don't know.
Yeah. It's perhaps even libertarian in a sense, but there's a very interesting and important book by Justin Tausey and Brandon Warmke called "Why It's Okay to Mind Your Own Business," and in it they argue they're both political scientists, although they may be philosophers, but that aside, they present an argument for why Americans need to do just that, mind their own business.
Which means, not living politics, which certainly Lebowski, it's probably the least political movie, Lebowski. I mean, he doesn't have a political bone in his body. Finally, David, there's so much to talk about here, and it's all very interesting. You first came on the show, you had a book out that I think came out either earlier this year or last year. Yeah, it was in April of this year. Exerbia Now, the Battleground of American Democracy. And you wrote about this sort of the outskirts of suburbia, which you call exerbia. Jonathan Rausch, wearing his Brookings cap, described this as an ordinary election. I'm not sure how much digging you've done, but did the exerbian vote determine this election? I mean, the election was determined by a few 100,000 voters in the Midwest. Were these voters mostly on the edge of the suburb? And I'm guessing most of them voted for Trump.
Well, Trump's numbers in Exerbia, I've dug around and found I've been able to find the exurban returns for Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Arizona. So three crucial swing states. If Kamala Harris had won those three states, she would be president. And Trump's support in Exerbia was off the charts, as it was in 2020 and 2016, and as I predicted it would be in 2024. I'm not sure that would have been sufficient to deliver him the race, and certainly not in the fashion that he won. Trump made gains with some groups that surprised people, other groups that didn't surprise people, but he did much better than expected. So unlike, say, in 2016, where we could have definitively and conclusively said Trump won because of a spike in turnout for him in rural America and Exerbia, here the results are more mixed, but it remains the case that the base most committed to Trump and most fervently loyal to his agenda is rural and exurban.
So
So
it's just outside the cities. And
yes,
finally, I argued, maybe counterintuitively, that America remains split today as it was before November the 5th. So I'm not convinced that this election is the big deal that some people think it is. You wrote an interesting piece in Salon back in 2020, arguing that Trump has poisoned American culture, but the toxin was here all along. And of course, there is more, if anything, of that toxin now. So even if Harris had won the election, that toxin was still here. Finally, David, how do we get rid of that toxin? Do we just go to put Bruce Springsteen on and go and watch Big Lebowski? I mean, how do we get beyond this toxin?
I would love it if that was the way to do it.
We'll sit in our bathtub and wait for the thugs to come along.
Right, exactly. No, what you're asking is of course the big question. We need to find a way to resurrect some sense of, I'll use another conservative phrase, civic virtue. And in doing
resurrection, of course, by definition, is conservative because you're bringing something back.
Exactly. And we also have to resurrect, to offer something more practical. We have to resurrect a sense of civics. One thing on which I have immense respect and admiration for Jonathan Rauch, one minor quibble I would have with him from your conversation is when he said that the voters rejected the liberal intellectual class and their ideas. Some voters certainly rejected, but some voters were unaware. The lack of civic knowledge in the United States is detrimental to our institutions. I mean, majority of Americans don't know how many justices are on the Supreme Court. They can't name more than one freedom enumerated in the Bill of Rights. So we need to find a way to make citizenship a vital part of our national identity again. And there are some practical means of doing that in the educational system. Certainly won't happen in the next 4 years. But to get to the less tangible matter of how to resurrect something like civic virtue and bring back ambition and aspiration in our sense of national identity, along with empathy, is much tougher. I mean, Robert Putnam says it thrives upon community and voluntary associations.
Putnam's been on the show, of course.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a conversation that will develop. I wish I had the answer, and I wish it was just to listen to Born to Run in the bathtub with the poster of the dude hanging overhead. But as I said to you before we went on the air, I think that you have a significant insight to lend this conversation, because in many ways your books were prescient. We certainly live with the cult of the amateur now, more so than when you wrote that book. So I'd love to hear your ideas,
David. And we're gonna, next time we appear, you're going to interview me about why the cult of the amateur is so important. So we will see you again soon, but we're going to swap seats. So David will interview me about the relevance of cult of the amateur. Wonderful conversation, David. I'd never thought about Lebowski or Francis Fukuyama, but particularly Lebowski in terms of what happened on November 5th. So very insightful. Thank you, David, and we'll see you again in the not too distant future.
Thank you. I'm going to reread Cult of the Amateur to prepare. I may even do it in the bathtub. I look forward to